Right now, two jets are closing on the same patch of sky over a city you've flown into. Between them sits one person who slept 3 hours last night. And, the worst part, the system planned for them to be that tired. Not allowed it or tolerated it, but actually planned for it. Decided, in writing, more than half a century ago, that the men and women holding those aircraft apart would eventually break, and built a whole career around that fact. You'll see the document that proves it. But first, you have to understand what the job actually is, because almost nothing you assume about it is true. Picture the voice you've heard 100 times without ever seeing the face, the calm one, the one that tells your pilot which runway, which heading, which altitude, in a clipped monotone that sounds like boredom. That voice is the last layer of protection between you and physics. And the person behind it is doing something your brain was never designed to do. Holding a three-dimensional map of 40 aircraft in their head, each one moving at 500 miles an hour, each one trusting that the calm voice has already solved a collision that hasn't happened yet. Here's the first thing that should unsettle you. Fewer than 11,000 certified controllers in the United States manage more than 44,000 flights every single day. Sit with that ratio. Then compare it to 1981, when roughly 13,000 controllers handled about 14,200 flights. More planes, fewer people. A workload that has, by any honest measure, roughly tripled per person. And you've been flying through it the whole time, trusting that the system underneath you was getting stronger, not thinner. It was getting thinner. You just never felt the floor moving. Now watch what that thinning does to the human being at the center of it. A controller can make thousands of correct decisions in a single shift, thousands of tiny, invisible saves, each one a collision that quietly didn't happen. And hear nothing. No alarm rings when you get it right. No light turns green. The reward for a perfect day is silence. The only feedback the job ever offers is the absence of disaster, which means the brain at that screen is running for 8 hours straight on a reward signal that never arrives. There's a word for a task that demands total vigilance and gives back nothing. Researchers would call it psychologically corrosive. Controllers just call it the work. And the math of that work hides a trapdoor. You'd assume traffic and stress rise together, step for step. A little more volume, a little more pressure. They don't. Studies of controller workload found that a traffic increase of around 1% produced roughly a 10% jump in critical incidents. 1% more planes, 10% more moments where something nearly went wrong. The load doesn't climb, it detonates. A sky that looks 1% busier to you is a sky that has become an order of magnitude more dangerous to the only person watching it. And they feel that non-linear spike in their body long before any official report ever records it. So, the system is understaffed, the feedback is silence, and the danger scales like a fuse. You'd think the answer would be to protect these people's rest above everything else. Watch what the schedule actually does to them. It's called the Rattler, a counterclockwise rotation, a 2-2-1, that crams 5 8-hour shifts into 4 24-hour periods, the start time sliding earlier and earlier each day, the body's clock dragged backward against the direction it wants to turn. The pattern ends with a midnight shift that begins after only a few hours off, when the controller is already running on fumes. And here's the part that sounds like a joke until you realize it isn't. Controllers ask for this schedule. They like it. It compresses the work week so tightly that it spits out an 80-hour weekend on the other end. So, they trade their sleep for their days off, willingly again and again. A NASA and FAA study measured what that trade actually costs. Controllers on the Rattler averaged about 5.8 hours of sleep across the work week. Before those final midnight shifts, the ones where they're talking your aircraft down in the dark, that number collapsed to roughly 3.25 hours. 3 hours of sleep, then responsibility for hundreds of lives moving at the speed of sound. When a federal review later examined the rotation, the reviewers were, in their own assessment, astonished that it remained legal under current regulations. The schedule earned its nickname honestly. The shifts turn around and bite back. And the body never forgives the direction. Human circadian rhythm wants to drift forward, later, not earlier, which is why flying west feels survivable and flying east leaves you wrecked for days. The Rattler demands the opposite. Every shift starts earlier than the last. dragging the internal clock backward against its own grain. So the body is perpetually ordered to sleep when it's wired to wake and to wake when it's begging to sleep. There is no adapting, because the schedule never holds still long enough to adapt to. By that final midnight shift, the controller isn't tired the way a long day makes you tired. They're operating in a kind of waking gray zone, reaction time stretched, vision tunneling, the brain quietly dropping frames it will never know it missed. And they're asked to do this for 30 years. The real question isn't why controllers burn out. It's how any of them last long enough to retire at all. But fatigue is only half the cruelty, and not even the strangest half. Because everything so far suggests the danger lives in the busy hours. The crush, the overload, the storm of traffic. Now, flip it. The quietest hours are the ones that kill. 3 in the morning, the radar is nearly empty. One controller, alone, watching a screen where almost nothing moves. You'd call that a break. It's the opposite. Vigilance is not something the human brain can sustain on command, and understimulation makes it nearly impossible. Most night shift workers, research shows, struggle to stay awake regardless of how much they slept. And the struggle gets worse, not better, when the work stops engaging the mind. An overloaded controller is at least awake. A bored one, alone in the dark, is fighting their own biology with nothing to push against. Watch it happen in real time. The hum of the equipment, the dim glow of a half-dead scope, a single blip crawling across the far edge. The controller blinks, and the blink lasts a half-second too long. The head dips, catches, snaps back up. They stand. They pace the small room. They talk out loud to no one, just to keep a voice in the air. None of it is laziness. It is a nervous system being ordered to stay razor sharp with nothing left to sharpen against. In 2011, that fight became national news. A lone overnight controller fell asleep at the position while aircraft tried to land, not once in isolation, but as part of a string of incidents that exposed how routinely the system left single exhausted people minding the dark. The lesson buried inside those headlines is the one almost no one took. Monotony is its own form of exhaustion. Staying alert when nothing is happening can drain a person faster than the busiest rush. The empty screen is a predator that looks like a rest. So now you have a worker asked to survive one of the most punishing schedules in the entire economy, fighting both overload and emptiness, on 3 hours of sleep, with a danger curve that explodes. A nurse in that position reaches for a sleep aid. A long-haul trucker fighting the same circadian wreckage reaches for something to take the edge off the anxiety. Reach into the controller's medicine cabinet and watch what happens. It's empty. Deliberately. Because here is the loop that turns the whole career into a trap. To control aircraft, you must hold a medical clearance. To hold that clearance, you must stay off a long list of medications. And that list includes most psychiatric drugs. Most antidepressants are disqualifying. So are most sedatives, tranquilizers, and anxiolytics. The exact tools every other shift worker uses to manage exactly this kind of damage. The controller is handed the most disruptive schedule in the workforce and ordered to manage it with one hand tied behind their back. No chemical help for the sleep. No chemical help for the anxiety the sleeplessness creates. And it gets darker, because the rule doesn't just block the medication, it blocks the asking. A controller feeling the early grind of burnout faces a choice that isn't a choice. Seek help. See a doctor, get a diagnosis, start a treatment, and that treatment can disqualify the medical clearance the entire career depends on. Getting help can end the job, so the help doesn't get sought. Pilots and controllers are among the hardest groups in the entire workforce to persuade to seek mental health care. And the reason is documented and rational. The fear that reporting treatment means losing the certificate, which means losing the livelihood. The result is a wall of institutional silence. The burnout doesn't get treated, it festers, precisely because the people carrying it are paid to hide it. The system filters out the ones who admit they're struggling and keeps the ones who've learned to say nothing, which raises the obvious question. If the people are breaking and can't say so, why doesn't the workforce simply grow until the pressure eases? Why are there fewer than 11,000 of them holding up 44,000 daily flights? To answer that, you have to go back to a single morning in 1981 and watch a decision detonate in slow motion across 45 years. That year, more than 11,000 controllers went on strike. The president fired nearly all of them. Over 11,000 people gone in a stroke. The FAA scrambled to replace an entire workforce at once, hiring a massive wave of new controllers across the early 1980s. It worked in the short term. The towers filled back up. But every person in that hiring wave started their career at roughly the same time, which meant they would all reach the end of it at roughly the same time, too. A generation hired together is a generation that retires together. The fix planted a bomb with a 40-year fuse, and the fuse has been burning down ever since. The staffing crisis you feel today, the one stretching 11,000 people across 44,000 flights, is the echo of a labor dispute most travelers have never heard of. Chronic understaffing isn't an inconvenience, it's a burnout engine. Too few people means 6-day weeks. It means mandatory overtime. It means the rattler gets pulled even tighter, the sleep gets even thinner, the silence gets even heavier. And the burnout that follows isn't a personal weakness, it's a structural output. The shortage manufactures the exhaustion, and the exhaustion is exactly what the system was already braced to expect. You'd think the answer would simply be to hire more. They're trying. And here, the trapdoor opens one final time. Roughly half of the people hired in a given year never make it to a live radar position. They wash out during training, about 3 years from their start date, before they ever separate a single real aircraft. So picture the rescue arriving, a class of new hires brought in to relieve the exhausted veterans, to absorb the overtime, to thin out the 6-day weeks. Now, watch half of them vanish before they reach the floor, 3 years downstream. The reinforcement keeps cutting itself in half before it ever arrives. The survivors don't get relief. They absorb the deficit of everyone who didn't make it, which deepens the exact burnout the hiring was meant to cure. This is the machine, understaffed by history, thinned by attrition, silenced by its own medical rules, ground down by a schedule that bites, and starved of any signal that the work was ever done right. And still, the worst thing that happens to a controller isn't the fatigue or the silence or the empty screen at 3 a.m. It's the day the absence of disaster ends, when 2 aircraft finally do meet, when the thing the entire job exists to prevent breaks through. The person at that screen carries it forever. After a recent mid-air collision near Washington's National Airport, recorded audio captured a controller, voice breaking, telling a pilot 3 words: "I messed up." A retired controller, writing about the toll, described the accidents as the thing that truly stays, the events that haunt controllers for the rest of their lives, even when they did nothing wrong, even when the investigation clears them, even when there was nothing left to do. Sit with those 3 words, not a report, not a defense, a confession from someone who, in the cold arithmetic of what actually happened, may have followed every procedure exactly as written and still watch the unthinkable cross their screen in real time. That voice belongs to a person who will replay those few seconds for the rest of their life. Every alternate instruction they might have given, every half second they might have bought, the one call they did or didn't make. An inquiry can study the tapes and assign no fault at all. It cannot reach inside the controller's head and lift the moment back out. The shift ends. For some of them, the shift never ends. And there's a final, counterintuitive cruelty folded inside that. The common assumption is that exposure hardens people, that after enough close calls, the nervous system adapts and the horror dulls. The research on critical incident stress says the exact opposite. It doesn't toughen them, it accumulates. And the damage doesn't even respect the line between cause and witness. Controllers who merely watched an incident unfold on their scope, who never touched the aircraft involved, suffer lasting effects too. The trauma doesn't require your fingerprints. Seeing it is enough. So the question stops being, why do controllers burn out so fast? The answer to that is everywhere now. The schedule, the silence, the staffing, the trauma, the medications they can't take. The real question is the one that's been waiting since the first frame. Did anyone know this would happen? They knew. They've been saying it out loud for decades. A controller who left that same Washington facility just hours before the fatal crash said frontline controllers had been ringing the bell for years, warning that the conditions were unsafe, and that the warnings changed nothing. And that controller was not the first. In the 1990s, the Controllers Union laid out its grievances: understaffing, overwork, antiquated equipment, sagging morale. read that list against the demands of the strikers back in 1981, and they are, very nearly, the same words. The complaint that air traffic control is breaking its own people is not new. It is roughly 45 years old, repeated almost verbatim, across generations of people who walked into that dark room and watched it happen again. Which brings you back to the document, the one promised at the start, the proof that the system didn't stumble into this, that it expected it. In 1972, Congress wrote a law setting a mandatory retirement age for air traffic controllers, 56. Not because the work is physically dangerous in the way coal mining is dangerous. The age was set because Congress accepted testimony that the cumulative stress of the job and the decline in the very specific skills it demands would, with age, begin to erode safety itself. Read that again, slowly. More than 50 years ago, the United States government looked at this career, listened to the evidence, and concluded that the people doing it would be worn down by it so reliably, so predictably, that the only responsible thing was to remove them by force at a fixed age. The retirement law isn't a health benefit, it's a confession. It is the system stating, in federal statute, that it expected to use these people up. The burnout was never a malfunction. It was a forecast, written into law in 1972, and confirmed by every exhausted, silent, haunted person who has sat at a radar screen in the half-century since, ringing a bell that was already quietly an answer to a question no one wanted to ask out loud. The two jets over your city are still closing. The voice is still calm, and the person behind it already knows how this ends, because the law that governs their career told them before they ever sat down.